Lesson 1-3, Properties of Numbers. Our essential question is what can you use to help you remember the commutative, associative, and distributive properties? Our first property is the commutative property. We have 3 examples over on the right to show you the commutative property. 2 plus 5 equals 5 plus 2. 7 times 4 equals 4 times 7. And x times y equals y times x. So what you can see from these 3 examples is that the commutative property says that it's okay to change the order of 2 numbers that are being added or multiplied. And it doesn't change the value. Okay, so that's the commutative property. It's okay to change the order of 2 numbers that are being added or being multiplied. Our next property is called the associative property. The associative property we have 3 examples of. You may notice that you see addition again and multiplication again. The order of the numbers, though, is not changing. So in the first example, 4 plus, in parentheses, 5 plus 6, is equal to 4 plus 5 in parentheses plus 6. The order did not change. The next example, 2 times the quantity 8 times 3 is equal to the quantity 2 times 8 times 3. Again, the order did not change. And our last one, x plus the quantity y plus z in parentheses is equal to the sum or quantity of x plus y in parentheses plus z. So the order did not change on any of those because we're not talking about the commutative property anymore. The associative property is when you change the grouping symbol. So you move the parentheses, you change the parentheses instead. So associative property, change the parentheses. And again, this is only good for addition and multiplication. So change the parentheses or the grouping of numbers. Being added or multiplied. Okay, then the last property is the distributive property. The distributive property is the one that we'll use the most in algebra. The distributive property says that 5 times the sum of x plus 3 is the same as 5 times x plus 5 times 3. 7 times the difference of 3 minus 8 is the same as 7 times 3 minus 7 times 8. And the last one, a times the sum of b plus c is the same as a times b plus a times c. So basically what you're doing with the distributive property is you're distributing the multiplication over the addition or subtraction in the parentheses. So you're taking the number outside of the parentheses, whether it's in front of the parentheses or behind the parentheses, it doesn't matter. You're distributing it to everything inside the parentheses. And distributing means multiplying it. Multiplying it. So distribute or multiply the number outside times everything inside the parentheses. I'm going to change my word there. Distribute. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to say distribute the number outside parentheses. To everything inside. And that means multiply. Okay. On our next slide, we've got a click and drag for the commutative, associative, and distributive property. And on this slide, in class, we would have students come up and volunteer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these properties a little bit more here. The commutative property, some of the things that can maybe help you remember the commutative property, the C and O, the first two letters in commutative, you could think of as saying change order. Change order. So the two things that are being added or multiplied are just changing order. Another thing that you might think about is the word commutative is kind of similar to the word commute. And if you know what commuting means, it's like when you drive from your house to work and then from work back to your house. That's commuting. Or you go from your home to school and then school back home. That's commuting. Another one would be communication. Like communication, the communication property would mean like you talk to someone and then that person talks to you. So anything that can help you remember the properties is helpful. The associative property. With the associative property, I think about like who you associate with, like who is in your group, who you hang out with. And that's what those parentheses represent to me. So they're a grouping symbol. Your associates are people you're close to that you hang out with. They'd be in your group. And then to distribute something, distribute means to pass out. Like if you pass something out, you distribute worksheets, you distribute flyers. So distributing something is like passing something out. So we show that with our little arcs where we distribute whatever's outside of the parentheses, we're passing that out. You could also think of it like passing a football, like throwing a pass. Or we sometimes say bombing, like you take that number and you bomb it, so you just bomb it times everything in the parentheses. So now, looking at the examples over here, commutative property, 12 plus 3 equals 3 plus 12, or m times n equals n times m, or 5 times 3 equals 3 times 5. Associative and distributive, they both involve parentheses, but the distributive property is when you pass something out. So this one, the 2 is getting passed out. It's distributed to the 4 and the 7. This one, nothing is being distributed. The order stays the same. The parentheses move like 1 and 4 are in the same group, then it's 4 and 6. Same on this one. ABC, ABC looks the same. The parentheses move. This one is distributive. The 4 is being distributed times the 5 and the 9. Another one that's associative, and then this last one, distributive. The A is being distributed times the B times the C. This should actually be a plus right here. There. So it's A times B plus A times C. Okay, this next page. This is where it might get a little tricky for you. We've got an equation written, and it's split into 6 different steps. Step 1 is just our starting step. And then on each of the additional steps, we're going to look for what's changed, and we're going to figure out what property was used. So on that first step, you notice that the problem started over here with no parentheses, and then they put in parentheses. So that is an example of the associative property when you change your grouping. Okay, the next step, they changed the grouping again. So the changes, the parentheses are now here So instead of having two sets of parentheses, they went to one set of parentheses around the terms in the middle. So it's all addition, and the associative property says changing the grouping symbols within your addition or multiplication. All right, next, notice that this order changed. So step 3 is the commutative property. The parentheses did not move. The numbers inside of them changed order. Step 4, the parentheses move again. So now there's two sets of them again. Step 5, the 12 plus 8 in parentheses stayed the same. This x got taken out of the parentheses. That is the distributive property. It's the reverse of the distributive property. Like instead of distributing to everything in the parentheses, they took out that common factor that was x. And then the last step is what we called an arithmetic fact, because that's just adding together 2 plus 4 and 12 plus 8. That's an arithmetic fact. So it can be tricky to figure out which property is used in each step. Just try to take your time and ask yourself what changed. So going from one step to the next, what changed on the problem? This next click and drag is a review of a lot of properties that you've worked with in the past, just to make sure that you're remembering everything from previous courses. So we've got the commutative property, associative property, and the distributive property that we just worked with. The reflexive property, your reflexes, when the doctor checks your reflexes, it's not intended to change anything. So the reflexive property looks exactly the same on each side. The symmetric property, symmetry, is like a mirror image. So symmetry is right here. If 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, then 7 is equal to 2 plus 5. Substitution is when you plug it in. So if x equals 3, you can replace x with 3. The additive identity is 0. If you add 0 to something, it keeps the same identity. The additive inverse is the opposite. So if you add the inverse to a number, you would get 0. The multiplicative identity is 1. That's the number that you can multiply and keep the identity. Multiplicative inverse is multiplying a number by its reciprocal, and the multiplicative property of 0. Anything times 0 equals 0. Now, for your summary, you should have 3 complete sentences, one for each of the properties, commutative, associative, and distributive. And I want you to really think about what you can use to remember those properties and keep them straight. So try to figure out something that will click with you so that you can figure out which property is which.